had, I think, about 3 to 4 judges breaking at this comp. It's very good to see juniors doing well and us not allowing them to come and judge the finals if they were eligible. But yeah, in general, I think SBS has seen a good revival and I hope it continues. And I see you next year at this side of the podium. And shout out to Dhruv, who's been a part of that revival, even though we're pretty old to be debating. But I don't have to say that in the middle of this room, so that's fine. Cool, yeah. The EU today has a massive energy crunch and it's pivoting away from the failed renewable energy strategy. We think this is the best form to go and do that and the best time to pivot away in the best manners possible. Here are 4 reasons as to explain why this energy shortage is actually a big problem within the EU and this is the best way to solve the shortage at all points of times. 1, the renewable market has massively failed. 1, there's an actively having a big competition from the Southeast Asian countries and companies within China and Singapore, which already have existing supply chains which are extremely strong. But 2, years of monetary investment in China at all points of times, which has led to China having a pivot in terms of the EV strategy, which they have necessarily gone ahead and done, and have done fairly successfully as compared to any other country. Second, there's a disconnect within the EU with regards to the Green Deal pivot at all points of times. Why is this true? 1, in the recent election, there was a pivot away from the left-leaning majority within the EU to a hard right-wing majority whose first and biggest agenda was to say that the Green Deal is a bunch of crap and we must go back to non-renewable forms of energy because that's more practical and more economical for the entirety of EU. This was very, very visceral in states like Belgium and Italy, which came out openly in the discussion and came up and said that the Green Deal was a failed investment and you must pivot away from it. This means there's an active consensus within the EU to pivot away from this strategy and go back to non-renewable forms of energy, and we're going to explain to you that going back to Russia is the only way to do that in the most economical ways possible. And thirdly, note, without this political consensus, you will not only have a failed green investment, but also lack any form of funding to produce the alternative, which are anyways very difficult because of the first reason I've given you. But thirdly, note, existing Russian alternatives are just way too strong already. Like Nord Stream 1 and 2 have already present infrastructure, which means even if you do want to take the hard stance on opposition and say we will fund this on our own, it's extremely difficult because you're going to face competition in multiple markets, but you'll have to face the existing infrastructure within Russia. Even if they're facing some sort of a crunch within economics today, I think the infrastructure is way too strong right now. So even if you have small amounts of money into it right now, it's still a very, very big competition to deal with, which means the cost of capital of reinvestment on your side without have support of Russia will just be way too massive for you to deal with. The last reason I want to explain is that the oil from Saudi is also not very, very certain. Because within the attacks in the Red Sea, it's very unlikely whether that will be an accurate replacement of Russian oil at any point of time, which means sure, it might have a very strong future 20 years down the line. It's just very unlikely for you to have a very good investment from the Saudi at all points of time to replace Russian oil. What this means is that the disconnect within the green movement forces you to have some sort of non-renewable energy, but alternate forms are way too expensive. What I want to do next is to provide incentives for the EU. The first thing obviously is that this oil is extremely important because it's going to be the most immediate form of money to solve the stabilization of the economy within EU. This is true specifically in the Balkan states where reindustrialization is specifically going on. What does this look like? Because of the expensive oil which is necessarily occurring and the fracturing of the Green Deal, these are specific states which due to migratory pressure within the Balkan states are actually having to revitalize this sort of employment and these factories who rely on these non-renewable energies at all points of time. These are critical countries within this EU which require this non-renewable source of energy to be a very stable form of function today, and the only way to do that is to have certainty of money at all points of time which comes from Russia. What is the benefit for you? Before that, I'll take your clarification.
Is Russian oil, in your opinion, sanctioned right now or no?
It's even if so, I'll take the best case. Even if it is sanctioned, it's still an existing infrastructure which requires less cost of capital anyway. So you have to debate on a comparative. Even if you have non-sanctioned, like the capital, access to capital, it'll still be far less for you to develop a good alternative because of this political fracturing. You still require cheap oil. This is specifically also why India has pivoted away from dealing with sanctioned oil and still take cheaper oil, specifically because it's way cheaper regardless of the sanctions onto it. This is why the deal will still be profitable. profitable. But the second obvious burden is, why will Russia specifically do this well, and necessarily they need EU market as well? Why will this be a quid pro quo thing? Three reasons for this. One, the current purchasing power which Russia has with consumers within the India and China is not necessarily immense. The first reason for this is obviously because China is pivoting away to an EV strategy anyways, which means the reliance on the Russian oil is not going to be the most confirmed in the coming future. The second, note EU is at all points of times a consumer market for these oils. Because of the industrialized process which is taking place, there's going to be a certain market for Russia, which is why they want to go and have this deal for the stability of money which they've lost. And third obvious reason is, because they've lost too much money in war, Russia wants this trade at all points of times to be profitable. So even if EU goes ahead and supports Ukraine within the war, but still have an economic benefit with Russia, Russia is willing to take that particular trade-off. What is the benefit which EU gets out of this? The first obvious one is that the small countries get the prices to be a stable level, which then they don't keep rising. The obvious impact of this, it solves the instability within the economy with regards to this. Because there's insane amount of demand right now and not meeting supply because all the reasons I've told you, this immediately solves that issue and stabilizes the factories in the Balkan states at all points of time. This is one of the most immediate reaction, because when you get stable access to oil, you are able to go and stabilize these factories and the constant forms of employment within them, which means the monetary impact is huge within this debate. But secondly, and note this is very crucial in terms of this framing within this debate, what is the Trump's view within the war today? And I want to be very specific here. Trump does not have an active issue with the war in its entirety. He has an issue with being the sole person responsible for solving everything and not being the flag bearer of it. He has a problem with him spending vast amount of money into the war and not with the war itself, which is what he's viscerally come and said, that we are spending too much on a war which is not our own. How do we solve that on our side? We think EU will always be able to help Ukraine by regaining its capacity, but also not have a pivot away from Trump or a bad reaction from Trump simply because of the reason I've told you. Before I move forward any further POI.
Yeah, do you think Russia might invade Ukraine again?
I've given you three reasons why they're an active incentive to be a mild actor. They've lost too much money in the war. But secondly, they're going to do it well within the EU. But also, that's interesting, right? Their case is going to be they're going to extend the war at all points of time. You have to note that insofar as EU has incentive, which is true in the current status quo when they promised 50 billion fucking euros to Ukraine by 2027, it is true that they do want to go and fund Ukraine to an entire level, which means that probably remains symmetric. The problem is, insofar as they're not able to regain the capacity on side opposition, A, that pivot never fully happens, which means the war anyways gets extended. But two, for worse, I think US's involvement gets very, very muddy simply because it's going to be uncertain as to what hand Trump necessarily plays without him being the flag bearer of solving that issue. Which means the first most precise impact in this debate is necessarily going to be about pivoting Trump away from this and not making him being the sole spender of money within this. Which means as EU, your incentive to go and fund Ukraine, which is true in the political consensus today, still remains true because of the regained capacity you're able to get from Russia. But two, you're able to stabilize your internal economy at all points of time. That means one, we're able to go and provide the most micro impacts to individuals within these factories within the Balkans, which is the most important thing right now, because probably the only thing which is going to be uncertain. But two, even if the war necessarily goes on both sides, we are the only side to explain to you that insofar as EU becomes the flag bearer of solving this, you're actually able to pump in money into Ukraine and potentially have some sort of response to Russia. But two, insofar as Russia is going to do it well because of the reasons I've explained to you, this also means that this deal is not going to be a bad one for EU and it's not going to let Russia play its arm at all points of time. Insofar that is the proven case in this debate. Orb has a burden then to explain why Russia does it very, very badly. Proud to propose.
Just a thank you speech before I start. I think this has been a really special comp for me. I was able to reach finals in 23, win this comp in 24. So just being back here is something which means a lot in 25 as well. Shout out to Shahid Bhagat Singh Debating Society. I think so 3 of our judges broke. Adamya from the first year also broke. Rudraksh and Akshat as well. Really, really proud of them. Special shout out to my teammates Sriram and Robin. Please don't do any hears. I might get distracted. I'll literally stop my speech if I get a lot of hears. Yes. Do it in your speech. Alright. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. There are three lies that they tell you. First, that Russian oil is cheap. Second, that alternatives don't exist. But third, that the oil that you get from Russia is sustainable. I'll break this down on these three parameters in the first place. But just starting on rebuttals, and because these will be really important. The first claim that they have is that there's a consensus that the Green Deal hasn't been able to achieve a lot of harms. But we think there's a greater consensus among EU countries that Russia is a really big enemy and you don't really want to align with that enemy in the first place. This is empirically why even when Trump embarrassed the Ukrainian president, the Ukrainian president met with literally every single European country within the European summits that they had, because leaders from heterogeneous countries like Germany, like France, etc. have shown open support that they don't want to align with Russia in the first place to begin with. But second, the second claim that they have is, oh, there's a really urgent need and you don't have any sort of alternatives at all. We think a lot of alternatives exist. I'll elaborate on them as well. But third, infrastructure within EU already exists for a couple of reasons. First, notice, when the war started initially, it was not clear when the war was about to be over, which means EU preemptively put a lot of investments within infrastructure, even in oil and gas in Norway and other Scandinavian countries, but in R&D in like fossil fuel, R&D in solar and wind energy, because they preemptively wanted to not depend on Russia later on, because when the Ukrainian war started, they weren't clear whether the war is going to end in future, so they wanted to preemptively be self-sustainable in the first place. This happened 3 years ago. They have done a lot of investments and they have been able to reap benefits out of those investments, which means alternatives in terms of energy are immediately available for them in the first place to begin with. But what are the 5 alternatives that I have which are going to be really important in this debate? The first alternative is literally just fucking USA. USA has a really big LNG industry and Trump has a lot of trade deficit that he wants to solve and he wants to bring back money within USA to begin with, which means Trump is willing to sell cheaper LNG to European Union because they want to lower their trade deficit and they want to earn a lot of money from EU in the first place. But the second important alternative is just the Scandinavian countries in general. Norway has the largest oil reserve within EU and the infrastructure has been already built within Norway for you to be able to take out oil and gas from those fields in the first place. This means that immediately within 3 or 4 months, you have the capacity to meet your needs but not depend on Russia, which is a bad actor in the first place. But the third alternative is Qatar, and Qatar has incentives to align with you for a couple of reasons. 3 reasons. First, it wants to come out of Saudi Arabia's shadow because Saudi Arabia has the most amount of market capture right now. But second, there is geographical proximity because Qatar is in Middle East, it's closer to Europe, so they have the capacity to transport that oil immediately to EU in the first place. But the third reason is they want to diversify and hedge their risk, which means Qatar wants to open itself to more markets because they don't want to hedge their risk and they want to be available to every single sort of market that exists in the first place. 2 more alternatives which you already have. The first alternative, and this is important, is within countries like Germany, Friedrich Merz literally just got elected, and the reason that he got elected was to say that Russia is fucking bad and we don't need to align or rely on fossil fuels, that nuclear energy and nuclear power is something that we can use to meet our self-sustaining needs in the first place. 3 reasons why you can use that nuclear capacity to generate nuclear power. First, the level of investment has been already done, which means nuclear plants already exist within Germany that you can already use to produce energy out of. But second, political appeal is already high because the government just recently got elected, which means they have incentive to put in money and budgets within those industry for them to set up infrastructure in and derive nuclear power out of in the first place. I'll take the clarif.
Yeah, like what is cheaper, having transporting a pipe like gas from a pipeline from Russia to EU or building a pipeline?
I have a lot of material on economics, don't worry about that. Yeah, the fifth comparative is just in terms of solar and wind energy. EU has put in a lot of money behind that, and this is really, really crucial. Why? Because EU also has an active carbon tax on companies which produce fossil fuels and emit fossil fuels in general. It's the reason why heavy tariffs exist on those companies, and we think green investment is something which has been done on a really, really large scale. Even if you face some competition, that doesn't mean that capacities haven't been built in the first place. 3 mechanisms to prove why Russian gas is expensive. This directly deals with their trade-off. First, notice, US already sanctions the ships that Russia uses to transport their oil in, which means even if EU is the one who is the negotiator, the ships that transport that oil are already sanctioned by USA, and this is important. Why? Because insurers are not willing to hedge their bet on these transporting ships in the first place. This means that the capacity of transporting cost is in general really, really fucking high because insurers from like EU and from USA don't want to hedge the risk against that. So the premium that Russian companies have to pay is in general really, really fucking high. This means that the oil is not cheap, it's really expensive to begin with. But second, I'll use their mech against them. Notice, empirically, and this is true, India and China had like leveraged power against Russia because Russia was crowded out from the Western world. What happens when EU starts dominating and starts interacting with Russia to begin with? Russia has more options, which means Russia's leveraging power increases. In their side of the world, Russia can only trade with India and China. That's why the price is lower. When another competitor comes in, they have to compete with each other, so you can push the price up and charge more money in their side of the world. And this is the mechanism how it pushes the price up instead of bringing it down, because you get more customers that you can sell this oil to in the first place, and this is crucial. But the domino effect as well, when EU starts lowering the sanction down, that means other countries from the developing world will also lower the sanctions down, which means Russia's leveraging power increases in their side of the world, and that is something which is really bad. But third, and this is crucial, notice, the money setup which is used to trade this oil is the SWIFT banking system. Russian companies have been actively exhausted and have been actively isolated from this system, which means the sanctions that they have to trade this oil is in general really, really high. Just visualize this. You go to an auto driver, but the auto driver just doesn't have the UPI that you want to pay from. That means the transactional methods in general have really, really high cost, because SWIFT is the universal mechanism that is used for this payment gateway. The alternatives are not, like, the alternatives first are not universal, but second, they are not cheap for you to opt into, which means Russian economy and Russian gas is not something which is good for you to begin with. But I'll take the best case scenario because I like to be charitable. Even if you get cheap oil, well, that oil is not worth it for three specific mechanisms. First, even if best case you get that ceasefire is unpredictable because Russia is an unpredictable actor due to three specific reasons. The first reason is Russia has patterns of invading countries again and again. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the Crimea region, and they militarized that region, which means when they entered again in 2024, they didn't have to send troops from Russia, they had to send troops from Crimea. This is crucial because now in the status quo, they have already gained two new regions in the first place, Donetsk and Luhansk, which means what happens in their side of the world, they'll start militarizing the region that they have already gained, which means in a patterned behavior manner, after 10 years, they can again invade and capture more areas, because this is the empirical evidence that they have done and followed in the first place. But second, Putin has also not been able to achieve the goals that they had set up. They wanted to capture 4 provinces, but they have only captured 2. But the pressure that they face from oligarchs to showcase some benefits has been really, really bad, which means they have incentives to continue this war, but enter this war again in the future. But the third incentive, and this is really important, Russia is unfucking predictable. You don't want to depend on an actor which is unpredictable, because this can harm you in the long run. Notice, Russia has set up alternative economic systems with North Korea and China, which means they can sustain wars and start wars later on as well. We think this also creates division among EU, because we think countries like Poland and Lithuania really fucking hate Russia because of the geographical proximity that exists. We think this leads to gridlocking of policies, which Sriram will elaborate later on, how this causes instability and like how this causes retaliation. Very, very proud to win.
Before I start, shout out to DTU and Sehaj, of course, for teaming up. Angad, I'm not thinking anymore, I'm tired. Okay, please ask a POI, do not heckle. Starting my speech in 3. Can you hear me clearly? Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's shit on their alternatives first. They say what you can do is that you can export natural gas from the United fucking States. Let's think about natural gas. How is it exported? Do you think it's exported via water? The answer is no, because it's too light. What is it exported through? It's exported through pipelines. The problem with pipelines is that good luck to Sriram in explaining that there is no existing pipeline that exists between the United States and Europe, because presumably it's the case that the geographical distance is really high, but more importantly, the United States is not a net exporter of energy, it is a net importer. The obvious reason for this is that the United States has historically been dependent upon the oil coming in from the Red Sea via Saudi Arabia into the United States, in which case it is unclear whether US is also sending the same oil abroad, because US is a net importer. But if they want to run the Canadian shoals, which is the best thing Sriram can come up with, India, like US and Canada are also under really bad relationships, and the relationship is bad to the point where Canada is fighting back against the United States, in which case the only extraction place of natural gas they had is gone away because they have really bad relationships with Canada. US as an alternative for oil or gas does not work. They second say is that there's unity within Europe for countries to align within the Green Peace Deal. And their example is Norway. The first obvious thing is that this does not engage with a bunch of countries that cannot engage with renewable energy, such as the Eastern European countries, such as the Balkan countries. And the most obvious reason for this is that these are really poor countries. So when the Green New Deal came in, most of these countries opposed that deal, considering that they did not have the internal capacity to go ahead and implement the same green energy technology solutions that Western Europe wanted them to implement. This is crucial for the debate because even if money existed in the common pool, it is unclear to what point EU would have funded it into the Eastern European countries, considering that the way in which they ask countries to go ahead and fulfill these obligations is by doing it themselves as opposed to creating a common pool of fund. We don't think OP ever proved whether Europe even had the capacity initially to do this or not. But the second thing I would note is that most of EU is also based on welfare, in which case even if they have this money, they do not go ahead and spend this in things like rebuilding these systems. What they just require is diplomatic compliance from different countries and not necessarily monetary help, in which case if the case has to work, it has to explain why money was the exact way in which EU forced Eastern European countries to go ahead and fall into line in the Green Peace Deal. The third thing I would note is that Germany is a wrong example because in most cases there is an active rise of the right wing in the European Union. The reason why Giorgia Meloni went to Trump and met him is because most of these countries are exactly right wing, and the thing about right wing governments is that they hate climate change, in which case they are active proponents of things like more oil, because these are the countries and governments that are lobbied by the big oil and shell companies the most, in which case their political incentives are directly tied to making sure that oil keeps coming in, and it's not the case that you suddenly pivot towards green energy because this is the political agenda that they came on, in which case that alternative also cannot work. The final thing I would note is that maybe renewable energy exists on their best case, but they need to explain why this is sustainable. So just the existence of it is not a reason enough for it to work for the European Union. This is unlikely for two specific reasons. The first is that there is active competition that exists in the market. The only response from them is, oh, but the Southeast Asian competition does not matter. Think about this. When China was dumping products into the consumer markets, presumably it was really bad because they had the capacity to dump, in which case Europe never had the capacity to go ahead and sell their products anywhere because they were always outpriced by a country like China, but also the fact that other Southeast Asian countries are much more labor intensive, in which case their ability to create goods at cheaper is much higher than for the European Union, where the wage costs are significantly higher, in which case Europe would potentially have to invest way more money into the same solutions as opposed to Southeast Asian countries, and hence they were unlikely to win in a competitive market if they were competing against the existing energy alternatives. The second thing is, maybe this is not true. We think that these sources are inherently unsustainable, and the reason for this is that most of these sources are based upon natural resources, the flow of which is extremely uncertain. So when you are dependent upon water for hydroelectricity, or when you are dependent upon the sun for solar energy, we think that these are very, very prone to two things. One, climatic shocks, and this is very true in the European Union because global warming is rising a lot. But even if you don't buy that, the bigger problem is that the active supply shortages have meant that you need a sustainable source of energy. So maybe the renewable energy works in a specific span of time, but they never explain why it is sustainable enough for the vast amounts of country to opt into it. If that is the case, none of their alternatives work. Why did the alternative work? And this would be another debate. The first is that Russia would give you a good deal. Their only response to this is to say that now Russia has everybody who they sell to, in which case Europe loses its leverage. This is uncomparative for two reasons. The first thing we pointed out is that the market that China and India were are markets different from what the European Union has. So you sell the cheap sell-offs of your oil to China and India because the purchasing power there is much low, but if the average European consumer has incredibly more high purchasing power, that inherently means that you sell the more costly oil to them, but at a relatively cheaper rate, because what you want is this oil also to be consumed, in which case you are likely to give Europe a relatively good deal in the first case. The second thing I would note is the fact that Russia has no margin, because if they agree that Russia already has the alternatives to sell their oil, then the war doesn't stop, because Russia presumably still gets money from alternatives such as India and China, or from other alternatives which they themselves assert, which is the reason for why the war will continue to happen regardless of whether this deal happens or not. So the margin never occurs on Russia, the margin occurs on Ukraine, where we say that if you are able to get more money as the European Union, your ability to fund the Ukrainian war effort or the war effort in Ukraine absent Trump involvement is substantially higher, because the comparative is that Europe will not have enough money to go and fund this war effort. Before I move on to why that's the case, shoot.
Norway has the largest oil field in EU, deal with all our alternatives, not just two.
God, bro, don't assert, give me reasons for it. Maybe it has the biggest thing, but that's not dependent upon how other countries believe. They need to explain why Norway has enough to go ahead and supply for the entire European Union. Russia is quite big, Nord Stream 1 is quite big, and it supplies oil and natural gas to all parts, to a majority of the European Union, in which case that case does not work. They need to be comparative. Okay, we win this debate because we explain that the urgent demands of the European Union will be solved via energy for two specific reasons. One, the cost costs drastically reduce. So maybe in their best case, these energy sources exist, but they are far more costly because the market is significantly more uncompetitive. On our side of the house, when you have both alternatives existing, the competition actually drives down prices. But secondly, this also makes the EU much more resistant to supply shocks in a world where you have diversified risk by also opting into the alternatives that they say, and oil as an alternative from Russia. The third is that you get far more investors, which is also the great thing because you are willing to say that you have not sanctioned anybody, and that's really good. Let's win on Trump now. Then the way we run this case is that what Trump wants, Trump doesn't want the Ukraine-Russia war to stop. What Trump really wants is he does not want to get involved, and he does not want the US to be involved. And the empirical reason for this is that Trump really does not care about whether Zelensky is good or whether Putin is good. They might say, but you're a great friend with Putin, but that's not true. Trump had an indicated preference 3 days ago when he said that if Ukraine and Russia don't agree to a ceasefire, I'm going to pull out. And the empirical reason for this is that the US does not care about getting involved anymore. This is crucial for the debate because on their side of the house, at the point at which you do not have money as the European Union and you do not earn money as a consequence of this deal, the crucial thing is that Europe has far less money to fund the Ukrainian effort. That has two implications for the debate. The first is that Russia will be significantly more powerful because what they are doing is that they are making Ukraine weaker as opposed to making Russia weaker. So they have no reason for why Russia will become weak. But more crucially, we explain that the pressures that Trump is imposing onto EU via NATO, because what Trump is saying is that EU countries should also increase more of their obligation into the NATO, is a reason for why the pressure on these countries will significantly reduce, which is the best thing for the debate because the comparative is that you continually lose territory if you don't have money to fund the war effort.
Great. I thank the PM for their fine remarks. Call upon DNL.
Fool me once and it's fine. Fool me twice, it's a skill issue. That's the problem with side proposition. Russia's made a fool out of you once. They want to go willingly and get themselves shot in the foot. Last time I was accused of not hearing enough of both the speeches that came before me. This time I've heard every word and it's all bullshit. Let's start with Vansh. For someone who's reading about motions for UADC, I think he should be more informed about trade statistics in the world. The US, in fact, is the largest oil exporter in the world. Take out your phones and Google right now. The US imports Venezuelan oil and refines them in their own refineries, exports to the rest of the world. They export more than Saudi Arabia. It is a lie coming from Vansh that you cannot export from the US. But second, maybe Vansh does not know enough about oil, about gas. There are two ways in which gas can be exported. First is through a pipeline. Second is through liquefied natural gas, wherein you liquefy the gas, put them in a tanker, put that in a ship, and send it across a continent. The point is, for their claim to stand, they have to explain to you on Angad's speech as to why the cost of liquefaction is so high that the costs are going to be incrementally high. This is why Vansh's speech does not work. But apparently I had not heard Sehaj's speech as well. So here are the line-by-line responses for Sehaj's speech. Sehaj's first mechanism is to claim that the Green Deal has failed and that is why renewables will not work in Europe. One, this is a lie for most parts. Far-right leaders often prioritize energy sufficiency, which is to say these are especially countries in Eastern Europe that have had painful memories of World War II, of having had Russian troops on their border. This is literally why Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, said, I never ever want a land border with Russia ever again. We will not do anything to enable Russia. Eastern Europe, which is what they hang their hats on, desperately wants to be anti-Russia because they are the ones who are most scared of a territorial expansion from Russia. But second, the leader of the president of the European Central Bank right now is literally Ursula von der Leyen, who is, guess what, a German, which, guess what, is a country that's been screwed over by dependence over Russia. I don't know why they're saying the one who's calling the shots literally does not like Russia. But third, they never engage with the mechanism we give you in Dhruv's speech, which is the idea that the EU has the world's most stringent carbon tax in the whole world. This is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which penalizes companies that use energy-intensive ways of production. So oil and gas are in general more carbon intensive than renewables for reasons I don't have to explain to you. I hope you know why, which means in general there is no support for this. But then what are the attacks we get otherwise? Their large claim is that solar, wind and other renewables cannot be scaled up. Here are three reasons why they can. One, there is strong domestic pressure within most European economies to do this because you're currently getting outcompeted by cheap electronic like EVs from both China and Tesla. So this looks like German manufacturers like Volkswagen not being able to sell enough because electric vehicles such as BID and Tesla are outcompeting them. There is a genuine pressure within European economies to get more cheaper renewables, which is why pressure exists from the same lobbies that often don't want you to go and do renewables. But second, there are often very cheap suppliers in terms of China. Sehaj uses this as an example for their side, but it's actually one for ours. Because China has reduced the cost of a solar cell by 95% in the last 20 years. They nearly hold a monopoly over lithium, cobalt, and every single thing you need for the renewable energy transition. Now, the lazy response that Angad will do after me is to say debt trap, but good luck proving that you will debt trap a European country. But third, the EU has recently signed a deal with Mercosur. Mercosur is basically, if you don't know, a collection of Latin American countries, and it is a trade bloc. This trade deal had been pending for 25 years. And you know what's unique about Latin America? They have some of the biggest mines in the world. Chile mines more copper than anywhere else. They have lithium mines, which are all things you need if you want solar and wind. Which means if cost is the problem, we've literally solved cost by so many other mechanisms which they have to respond to in Angad's speech. But then what do they say? They say Southeast Asian market is competing. Really look at your notes. I'm not kidding. Really look at your notes. Is there any reason why there is any feasible energy alternative in any of Southeast Asia? All Southeast Asian countries are net importers of energy needs because there is no single profitable oil mine, gas mine in any of Southeast Asia. Their analysis in Vansh's speech is so cookie cutter. They say Southeast Asia low labor, but to do the labor you need the oil in the first place, which you don't have, which is why Southeast Asia does not work. Then they hang their hats on the Balkan states. They say Balkan states want to reindustrialize. The problem, as I've already told you, is that most European countries don't want to do this at the expense of increasing territorial sovereignty for Russia because they're scared of post-World War II reasons. But I would posit there are so many European countries that are not reliant on industrialization. Europe has four main parts to it. Western Europe, which is Germany, is presumably the most industrialized. Southern Europe is a tourism-heavy economy which does not need so much oil and gas for its economies. Northern Europe is literally trust fund money. There's like Norway basically has a sovereign wealth fund which funds everything, which means their claim at best applies to two countries. Dhruv preemptively weighs this out. He says that European Union often requires unanimity in most major decisions, which means even if you end up isolating Eastern European countries because they're so anti-Russia, they block every single other policy that you need to pass in the EU, which means you get gridlocking at a far larger scale. That is why Balkans do not work. The way up is simple. The problem is this: there is no urgency right now. You can connect renewables to industries. So imagine this: there is a factory, there is a solar panel outside the factory, there is a windmill outside the factory. The problem is that we have not been able to connect renewables to grid storage for households. So you can't get solar energy for houses right now. And guess what? It is not winter right now. Most of Europe's most energy intensive needs happens in winter when you want more heating, etc. Which means we have enough time to scale up renewables. There is no urgency. But before I deal with their claims on Russia and Ukraine, sure.
The fact that you failed against Tesla was an important factor for the right wing to market this and come into power and say you failed, hence you need to pivot away
Sehaj, read the news. The CDU has come into power. The AFD is the one who's pro-Russia. Your claims have no backing in the news. Russia. Their claim on Russia is simple. They say you have more money left because Russian oil is cheap. Other than the fact that all of this relies on you buying the premise that Russian oil is cheap, which we've disproven, even if that is the case, here are two things. One, more money being left for something does not mean you spend it on Ukraine. You can spend it on more pressing needs which have domestic buy-in. What are these needs? Subsidies. Europe's agricultural subsidies are a big issue because more farmers want more subsidies. If anything, populist pressures demand that you put that money in agricultural subsidies and not in Ukraine. But if that was not convincing for you, here's the second reason. EU, for the first time, Germany has recently amended its debt brake, which is a way for them to increase defense spending. And EU in general wants to increase its defense spending right now to counter the threat of Russia. Imagine the contradictory messaging. On one hand, you say, let's give Russia money so their industries have a lot of money and they can fund the war effort. Then let's also increase the defense spending on our side so both sides have a more to fight on. That is contradictory messaging that literally never works, which means they can't fund the war in Ukraine. But what is the collateral damage of all of this? We've proven to you in Dhruv's speech as to why Russia is likely to invade Ukraine again, even in the best case where there is a ceasefire. The reason for this is simple. Putin wanted to annex 4 territories: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaragoza. He's only annexed 2 of them. He's only gotten 20% of Ukraine. He wants more, which means any ceasefire is temporary. Putin is likely to do it again. You don't get any benefit there, but you isolate US, which is a much bigger partner for you. For all those reasons, oppose.
I thank the yellow for their kind remarks. Calling upon proposition 1.
Yeah, shout out to radio starting in 3, 2. One, this is what happens when you teach too many WSGC kids. You prove one burden, but you completely miss out the second. This is the issue. They prove there's incentive for EU to go ahead and to return to green. They never prove why EU has the capacity to go ahead and do this when they are facing looming tariffs by Trump, but they also have heavily invested in like things like welfare, because 50% like money of the entire like countries go ahead and funding free healthcare, free education for everyone. But also they have like pledged billions and $50 billion to Ukraine war fund right now. I don't think they ever prove why there's a capacity to scale up. They prove incentive to scale up this green energy, and that's the only case and the only counterfactual basically which they have to say that you will have alternatives to energy and there's no energy crisis. I want to first talk about the other alternatives because they literally drop it at Sriram's speech, but let's talk about them. They say that you can just liquefy gas and put them in tankers. Do you know how much time it takes to cross the pond, cross the Atlantic Ocean using a tanker? It takes like 40 days. You know how much time it takes for like one pipeline to just start pumping oil right now? Probably 5 seconds, because you just turn on the switch. That is a time lag that you need to also cater to. It's also the increased cost of liquefaction from US to then shifting it to like EU at any points of time. On our side of the house, you have the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines that are already established. You just have to turn them on, and this is what the motion says. You have to return to Russian oil gas. You have to create them completely from scratch. This is what they miss out on. Building capacities using Qatar and every other country that they talk about will take time. That is exactly what you don't have, because after 90 days the tariffs are going to kick back in, and when that happens, the cost of production and cost of living in the EU will skyrocket. You do not have that time, and you need to go ahead and build that capacity right now to start running your factories, so that factories can employ people and then start going ahead, and people can start going ahead and start consumerism basically of basic goods and services, which are going to skyrocket as soon as the Trump pause goes away. This is what they do not understand. They say incentive, they never prove capacity. We explain to you why you get capacity uniquely on our side of the house. How do you do that? Because the infrastructure is already established, there is no upfront cost to go ahead and do this, which means you just start going ahead and importing right now. When you get oil and natural gas, and this is true for a lot of countries in EU, not everyone has changed their like energy supply grids to nuclear and windmill and solar because they don't know what's the efficacy of them. They have historically seen the efficacy of oil and gas. They have historically had supply chains built on oil and gas. It's very difficult to transition. It takes a huge upfront cost for companies, even small companies and factories, to go ahead and shift completely to windmills, because they have to basically buy a huge farm to build a windmill. You need a nuclear reactor to build nuclear energy. I don't know why every small company has that capacity. What they can go ahead and connect to the mains and the supplies of the country, which can be run on just oil, because you already have run this for so many hundreds of years. When you have that infrastructure that's already present, I think it's just turning on the switch is just better, which means when you get cheaper oil as a factory, you obviously can subsidize your production costs. When production cost goes down, you can produce more goods, because that's how economy of scale works. When you have more goods, you export more, you get more money into the country, people consume more goods, you pay your laborers more, people get more money. That is how you build capacity for the European Union, by revitalizing the economy, starting the industrialization process again, which has largely been paused. That is why the money comes. That's why you save money, but you also get more money because you now start exporting those goods. That means capacity increases. When capacity increases, and this is what they drop again from those speech. They say we care a lot about what happens in Ukraine, right? I think if you want to actually fund Ukraine and meet the promise of $50 billion that you have given to them by 2027, you need to build this capacity. If you care so much about giving Russia the middle finger, you really need to use this money and start spending in Ukraine and start funding that war deal. But let's assume EU does not care about Ukraine, right? Because they say that you can start like subsidizing agriculture costs for farmers and all those things. That is true. But how do you ensure that this money is something that you can just naturally build when you're investing so heavily in nuclear technology that's not been tested on economies of scale, but also windmill, which is not largely efficient in the first place, which means it's very difficult for you to go and do this. Second thing I'm going to just explain is why will Russia give you a good deal and why it won't be as expensive as they say. I think it's very simple. They say that you have sanctioned Russian oil tankers. Like I said, you need a pipeline. You don't need tankers. I don't know how you sanction a pipeline, but let's assume you can go ahead and do this anyway. I think Russia will still give you a cheaper deal because of multiple reasons. One, their own characterization that if the green revolutionary wave is increasing and renewables are on the rise, Russia wants to undercut the pricing or the cost it requires to set up a windmill. That means they're going to give you oil for cheaper than what it takes for you to set up a windmill farm or a nuclear energy reactor, so that you start buying oil from them. Because obviously when you start buying oil from them, Russia gets more money to fund the war effort. It's a or perverse incentive and make sure that you give them oil for cheaper rates as opposed to giving them a higher rates. Secondly, I think they also concede that China has shifted largely towards solar energy and they are at the pioneers of going and doing the renewable energy resources. If that is true, then China is also not importing as much oil. I don't know what the large competition is which increases the prices so much if every country is so threatened by like the sanctions that Russia has right now. If that is true, obviously the competition is less, but also it's more proximate to you, so it's going to be cheaper for you to go ahead and buy oil from Russia. I don't think the mitigatory reasons of saying that you can do it otherwise or Russian oil is expensive is good enough. I think they really need to debate how does EU build capacity to expand the kind of green energy they have on scale. I'll take you, sure.
You haven't responded to our immediate capacity claim, which is US has a deregulation and fracking boom. Trump wants to drill, baby, drill, which means you place an order with the US right now to get the oil in a week.
No, because you can't just fly in the oil. You can start the oil on our side in 5 minutes. So if it's delta of time, we are anyway winning. And I don't think that Trump and Canada are on best terms. The kind of oil you want and the fracking you want is basically happening in Alberta Sands. And Alberta Sands is not going to give you oil right now because Canada and US are not have the best relationships. I don't know how Trump gets this insane amounts of oil. But if he does, and Trump wants to tariff every other country, he wants to start domestic production. So I think he'll use the oil to start his own domestic production as opposed to starting exporting more oil to EU. If that happens, I don't know how he starts his own economy. I think there's a very clear incentive for Trump to not go ahead and sell more and more oil to EU at this point of time, which means that you need an alternative. You just return the alternative, which is already something that's established, and you just go ahead and ensure that you can save more costs in terms of production. Every company can save more costs, every factory can save more costs because the grid already is something that has like established supply of like the oil in the first place, which means on our side of the house, you just start the economy and industrialized process much faster. They say Germany, France have already done it, but I don't think that the debate is restricted to just those countries, right? Because obviously there are more vulnerable countries in European, which are the Eastern European countries, the Balkan states that do not have that capacity to shift to nuclear energy. Have you ever heard of like I don't know, Romania going ahead and building like Czech nuclear energy? It sounds so ludicrous. I don't understand why there's an incentive to go ahead and for every country to just build a capacity for everyone, specifically when you don't have the money to go ahead and do this. There is incentive. We might even agree because we don't think the incentive is there because we to explain that there's a fraction within the EU Parliament because of rise of right wing. But even if we agree with that, they never prove capacity. We explain that capacity is built over time when you save production costs and you start exporting more because you start the industrial process for all those reasons. Go.
I thank Proposition Whip for their fine remarks. Calling upon Opposition Whip.
This is Robin going as opposition whip. So the first shout out is to SRCC in general. It has always been very nice to me personally, and like I love all people in SRCC, and SRCC has generally been very lucky to me, like Arun Jaitley, and I think everything all of you guys know. Not this year. Yeah, I was best speaker this year. It's fine. At Arun Jaitley. Okay, yeah. Second shout out to my lovely teammates. Last year Sriram and I dropped in semis from Dhruv, but now we united. So yeah, and Sriram and Dhruv both were amazing teammates. So shout out to them. And lastly to Lavanya, like because obviously, okay. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In the past 3 days, Hadar has taught me a lot of wing, so here it is. Let us assume for a second that we are losing economics, that Russian oil is cheaper. So both of them debated against them. I'm not going to debate against them. I'm saying that this team is better and they won on economics. I'm going to explain that because Russia is an unpredictable actor and we receive no response to that, why the future harm of unsustainability should matter more than the current harm of foregoing a cheaper oil because you are going for an expensive alternative. First reason, it is easier to do adjustments of a higher cost when the excess expenditure is spanned across a long time. This is an accounting concept. In an EMI, it is quite convenient if it comes at a higher cost because the pressure at the moment is quite less because they don't have to pay a lot at the moment. On comparative, when European Union in the future, whenever Russia does something bad, is forced to sanction Russia again, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, it is a very big cost in the moment. On intensity, the impact is actually super high, primarily because it is tough for you to make very big adjustments in your of planning, primarily because everything comes crashing down at the moment, because you never know when a war is actually about to come. But secondly, we don't need to prove 100% certainly that Russia is definitely going to do something stupid in the future. Even some possibility of it leads to our impact actually being accruing, because internally, when European Union is deciding this in internal politics, we explained that some states are actually scared about Russia intervening in the future, primarily because a lot of states have historic bad ties with Russia because of Russia intervening them also. This means even some possibility of it leads to our impacts, because EU states have the perception that Russia might do this. So in internal planning, a slight chance of it happening means that you ought to care more about the future possibility that will be so bad as opposed to an increased higher cost. But thirdly, let's just say everything they say is right. What is the impact? The end impact of their side is that on our side we have to pay a higher cost because Russian oil is cheaper. So the implication of this is that we don't earn as much as European Union. Therefore, the GDP growth is slower on our side than it would be on their side. This is the actual impact. So I think this can be managed, because to cover up the increased cost, you can find alternative means of revenue like selling your own green energy. So we do face an impact, but it is not actually much. When you compare it to the comparative, the impact of sanctioning Russia again in the future, and when smaller countries are also forced to sanction, they don't have capacity to flip and flop again and again. Because first they were trading with Russia, now do you ask them to stop? Now you're saying, okay, trade with Russia again. In future, when Russia does something bad, you will ask them to stop again. This has severe effects on them, primarily because this affects the most vulnerable people on the ground because of a big oil crisis. Right? Energy is an essential good. When the availability of energy goes down, when in future you are supposed to sanction Russia again, this has effects on other industries also, primarily because most industries require energy. This means when energy crisis happens, all other crisis happens. So the impact of inflation actually occurs on every other good and not just energy to begin with. This means at the ground level, energy shortage leads to all other prices actually going down. This has damaging effects on the most vulnerable and on inflation. Therefore, on intensity of harm, our impacts are actually quite important. The fourth weighing metric is the need metric of actually having saving energy cost itself. Sriram explains to you that Europe has no urgent need of energy because only one or two countries are in the reindustrialization process, as Vansh explained. But in most countries, energy is not a very big need because they are not reliant on a lot of manufacturing. They are reliant on things like tourism and other things which don't require energy as much as other places would do. This also responds to Angad when Angad talks about it takes time for US to come, because if there is no need metric for you to actually save cost. So the conclusion of all this weighing is that even if you believe as an edge that they are winning on cost, we still win this debate because Russia is an unpredictable actor and Russia can fuel the ball anytime, and everybody knows this, primarily because historically whenever Russia stops, Russia does something again in the future also, and that is always happened. So we think you ought to care more about this. Now that I've done I have taken a bigger step, now let's actually win economics also. What are the reasons they give? The first reason they give is that competition from China and Southeast Asia. Sriram explains they don't have oil. Here are two other responses. A, competitive advantage can be developed in different niches. Southeast Asian countries are quite good in solar energy because by virtue of their geographical location. On comparative, we think on your side you can actually be quite good in nuclear energy by virtue of access of nuclear technology from France, because France is a P5 country. But two, you can beat competition over time because when you start a new industry, there's a higher upfront cost which has already been made by the way, so the benefits come over time. So even if you have an increased cost right now, slowly 1 year down the lane, the costs keep on rising down, primarily because that is how business works. You have a high capex now and you are in loss making right now, but slowly the cost would come out as you reach scale. But secondly, they say Russia will give you the best deal because Angad says Russia has competition from green energy, therefore Russia ought to give you a great deal. Okay, but 1 year down the line, once you become dependent on Russia again, they can shoot up the prices. What stops them from shooting up prices again 1 year down the line? Primarily because over time more and more countries start depending on Russia. Dhruv explains to you there is a domino effect because when EU starts trading, other countries start trading also. This means that Russia has a lot more leverage over other countries. This explains that Russia can literally increase costs at any time. Thirdly, Angad made a sassy comment to Sriram by saying that, oh, they never prove capacity. Here are 4 things. Number 1, most investments have already been made, so it's unclear why you need the capex right now, because they were literally 2 to 3 years when you did not trade with Russia. What did you do? You obviously did the capex, so the highest cost upfront has already been done. But secondly, Sriram tells you a lot of reserve money is already there because European nations are quite rich, so it's unclear why Europe has a capacity issue, which we're not talking about like Bangladesh. But thirdly, nuclear plants already exist because of NATO's nuclear sharing technology. My MBA knowledge has told me that P5 countries have nuclear technology, which means that US and France literally share this technology. Literally Turkey also has nuclear energy by virtue of UK actually having a nuclear plant in Turkey also by giving them nuclear energy to begin with. But fourthly, Qatar is also sending you oil via pipelines, so all that also becomes symmetric. Shoot.
Yeah, sanctioning Russia again on your side is terribly uncertain. In 90 days, it's an urgency. We need money on oil right now. We save that cost initially. You can't explain that.
Okay, Angad's reasoning of uncertainty is nothing because they never responded to. We explained that empirically Russia has done this in the past. So even if we have not proven 100% certainty, even if we have some doubt that Russia might do it again, we think the weighing metric of severity and extent should matter more than the possibility of it. Even a slight possibility should allow you to vote on our side. Okay, what are the reasons that we gave you that this oil is actually quite expensive? A, tax. European Union has a policy about CBAM, which Sriram explains to you, which means you have to tax everything. So even if in pipeline it gets quickly, you have to tax it, so there's a higher cost. Tax is also recurring, which means that this is the cost which happens again and again in every supply of oil that actually comes. But number two, we explained that the insurance cost also rise because of sanctions. They never respond to this. But thirdly, we told you Qatar is an alternative. They never responded to this. But fourthly, we win on USA also because US is becoming isolationist. It wants to do production more, therefore it wants to export more. How will USA earn money, right? USA will only earn money because of exporting these things. Therefore, USA actually wants to export the liquefied thing to you. But fifthly, we also will do a mechanism about swift payment getaways, which means that the transaction costs are also quite high. Panel, finance is quite complex. Finance is not just that Russia is just giving cheap in the very basic 100 rupees. The cost added on the 100 rupees, like gateway payments, like insurance, like tax, all this actually ends up adding up. Because of all those reasons, we win on economics. Even if you don't believe that, we are still winning because of my first wing. Thank you.
I thank opposition whip for their fine remarks. Open reply.
Oh yeah, by the way, thank you. SRCC has always been a tournament I look forward to every year to do. Hopefully this will be my last, but yeah, every year I've been here, it's been kind of nice. One year I got knocked out in the semis, but otherwise I think smooth sailing. So that being said, let us get to business. You must not let lies win a debate. That is what you should think when you cast your ballot today. Here are 3 independent reasons why we win the debate solely based on non-engagement because they did not know enough about the world. 1. This move isolates Eastern Europe, who is anti-Russia. We give you reasons across first and second speech as to why they have painful memories of World War II and don't want to enable Russia. The problem is Sehaj did not know this. He wanted the Balkan countries to industrialize using Russian oil. That is political suicide. Which means the impact of this still stands. We explain across 3 speeches that this gridlocks European Parliament because it requires unanimity, which means that any and all policies that Europe has to do, which includes, by the way, Ukraine's strategy, will require unanimity, which they never get on their side and anything else on Europe. But even if you believe the claim on this simplistic geography 101 that they try to do, where does the Nord Stream pipeline go? Have they ever explained to you that it goes directly to Eastern Europe? Because we explained to you in Dhruv's speech that Qatar is actually near Eastern Europe. So if you want to buy that simplistic 101 speech from like Angad, Qatar presumably is much nearer to Eastern Europe. We fulfill the premise anyway. But here's the second reason why we win. This move angers US incredibly, which means you have high repercussions later down the line. We explained to you that the US currently wants to broker a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, but Russia is not cooperating. It has already violated a ceasefire, which is why we explain in Dhruv's speech that the US has moved to sanction not just Russian oil, but the ships carrying the oil and is willing to do more. But the problem is, our counterfactual comes at the cost of their counterfactual. You cannot simultaneously buy Russian oil and simultaneously buy LNG from US, which means you isolate your most long trusted ally who you have NATO membership with. That is a damning world for side proposition. But third, we give you a million alternatives in Dhruv's speech, and I get that he's not that experienced as Angad and Vansh, but I think we should respond to him more. Because Dhruv gives you so many reasons as to why you can import oil from elsewhere. And the only response to all of this is, this happens in the future, except we explain that US oil happens right now. Robin explains that nuclear plants have always been in Europe, it's just that they've been decommissioned. Robin also explains that you've been developing R&D for solar and wind plants in any way. I explained to you that solar and wind and renewables have already been integrated into industrial processes. It is just that it's not there in household, which means they never answer all of our million alternatives, which means they lose on all these 3 metrics. But let's get to Ukraine, because apparently that is what they want to win on. I was shocked by how rudimentary that analysis analysis here is. Because across three speeches, there is one line of analysis, which is you have more money. Like, guys, just gut check. If you have more money, do you use it to like the best purposes always? We give you structural reasoning to explain why the populist pressures within Europe likely mean this money goes into agricultural subsidies and not Ukraine. We also give you reasons as to why increasing your defense expenditure to counter Russia and then also giving money to Russia to fund its military is a contradictory objective which you cannot do in the round, which means they cannot win Ukraine. But to give them the ballot on Ukraine, you have to be convinced that the Russian energy is cheaper, because the only way you save money is if Russian oil is cheaper, which Dhruv gives you excellent analysis of why that is unlikely to be the case. Then you have to ask yourself, is Russian oil really cheaper? Because obviously like they don't understand that liquefaction doesn't cost that much, but let's say it costs a lot. Here is the thing, they are unresponsive to the million reasons Dhruv gives you as to why you need insurers, you need countries to okay this. You generally need to pay them via some mechanism which they are cut out of right now because of the SWIFT banking system. Which means even if you buy Angad's reason, there are so many competing claims to question whether a Russian oil is indeed the cheapest in the world. Because how do they want to weigh this debate on? And this is where it gets funny. They say there is such an acute energy shortage in Europe right now that people don't have like any energy at all. Like Robin kind of funnily explains that this is not Bangladesh. Like I don't see why any average intelligent voter should believe that the average European household literally does not have any electricity going on right now. We explained to you in second speech that the most acute energy needs arise in the winter when things are cold, when you need to heat your house. We are not in the winter right now, which means the energy claim, urgency claim does not work. But I flip the urgency claim when I say the urgency is in fact to do renewables, because Russia can militarily intervene in Ukraine again. That means that you need to safeguard yourself against that possibility. That is why we win on their own metrics.
I thank our people for the final box. Probably.
Russia is very unpredictable, but somehow Trump is magically the most predictable politician in the world, because their op-bench response on this is to say that our alternative is to actually get oil from fucking USA, and the most certain thing in this debate is probably USA going in and giving you this on the most certain thing. Guys, there's been a tariff which is going to come back in 90 days and fuck you a lot in terms of the EU's oil stability, which means the most uncertain actor in this debate, something which both sides concede, is Donald fucking Trump. That means on a comparative, sure, bunch of us give us like bunch of reasons as to why one is more predictable and why is not, but I think it's most certain that Russia, who you are returning to with existing infrastructure, which just Angad responds to by explaining why it's comparatively better, is a better place to come back to in the interim time of 90 days, which is where you need to rebuild all of this before the tariffs kick in. This is why it's specifically important. Even if they're right, surely you can develop oil infrastructure in 2-3 years on their side. Correct. But the problem is you don't have that much time. That's why this debate is comparative. It has to be about whether you go and regain current infrastructure within the Russian partnership, or you want to go and rebuild entirety and take the trade-off of time. This team never does that. They want to win on time because they think alternatives also solve that magically, but they also want to be the morally correct actors and non-align with Russia at all points of time. And here's another funny thing. Their mech is that, oh, you have historical hate for Russians, which is why you don't want to align with them. Note, that was the left liberal push within the Balkan states which had that hate. The right liberal, like right-wing parties, literally pushed for industrialization because they said, fuck the rhetoric, we must have money within the EU. And guess what? They were voted into power on a majority. That is why the most amount of people within the EU right now or in these vulnerable states actually care about industrialization and price stability more than they care about historical hate. But also, gut check this. If the historical hate for Russia is increasing, we tell you use their money and potentially that's the only way you come to a leveling streak. The problem on their side is US tariffs kick in, you are literally strong-armed into having no capacity against Russia at any point of time, which means even if you want to go and benefit Ukraine, which they say you have a historical hate for Russia, but you don't want to benefit Ukraine, you want to go and spend into agriculture, it's all a lot of tension. What we tell you is fairly simple, and this is where the debate actually lies. It lies in 5 reasons I tell you on why renewable energy shortage is real, and they tell you that there are a bunch of alternatives. That's where the majority of this debate happens. They drop all their alternatives, and this is crucial after LO, because they know the only winning one they have is probably USA. This is strategic to their case. Nos, The way they want to weigh that in comparison is to say US is probably going to be cheaper and more stable as compared to Russia. I think there's a lot of analysis coming from our side to explain why it's cheaper to go ahead with the Russian alternative. But funnily enough, no spec works. The literally only standing thing in this debate is that it's existing infrastructure with the Russian partnership versus developing new ones. And they're fair, but it's not new. We've spent 2-3 years investment. I take that trade-off. It's 2 years of investment versus 10 to 15 years of Russian partnership investment, which is already weighed out to you, which is why Angad's spec is actually important. These pipelines are already developed within this partnership at all points of time, which means on a comparative, sure, they can develop it in 2 years. It's just much quicker and much more stable with the Russian partnership. And sorry, I might be a bad person framing debate, but I do it in this debate. I tell you 4 reasons as to why Russia will not do it in the worst forms with you, because they also want to expand their markets at all points of time, which means not only these markets existing, but they're also probably going to be stable. What is Robin's response to this? And this is where I want to weigh both cases against his weighing. He says the problem with that is they might increase the cost 1 year later. What's the comparative? Like the comparative is expensive US oil because they're anyways putting tariffs on you regardless, which means to level those tariffs off, you require some form of stability. Insofar as my incentives for Russia to do it well stand, they are going to give you comparatively better price than any other country. That's the only way they're going to regain you into the market anyways. That means you have to get a comparatively better price, even if not the best one. But second thing Robin wants to win on is time. You already told you why that's not the most prior thing. Literally the only thing standing in this debate is comparatively in all of the alternatives, you still get cheaper and more stable oil. But secondly, insofar as its existing infrastructure, it still has the most proximate impact in this debate, apart from the bunch of spec which the debate has, which nobody understands.
And thank proposition reply. With that, we come to an end of this round and the ring to SRDL of 2020.